Tea is marked in every soldier's daily calendar as a place not just to take refreshment, but to reinforce comradeship and share culture. The stories that are told at tea time are very often exaggerated for comedic or dramatic effect, but they often generate a much more tangible outcome than day-to-day work back in the office. Through this lens, in this podcast, we talk to leaders from all industries and all walks of life. We want to know how they got to where they are now. What are their top of mind issues in leadership? And most importantly, what's coming around the corner that they've noticed that the rest of us haven't seen yet? And how are we going to prepare for that? You're listening to Reese and Jerry. Welcome to the Tea and Medals podcast. Welcome everyone to our inaugural episode of Tea and Medals. Reese and I have put this podcast together specifically because we want to try and capture the perspectives of some great leaders that we know in our network from being in the military and from our experience in the commercial sector, but really for them to tell their leadership story through a different lens. It's probably not very surprising that we've managed to co-opt a very special guest today, who is, I could say, known to me, and that is Michelle Osborne, and the name's the clue here. But far from being just the brains in the outfit that I call my family, Michelle is also the head of military veterans affairs and emerging talent for JPMorgan. Cut short, that means that she's responsible for a lot of programs within JPMorgan that are providing a pathway from either military employment through to professional services, in professional financial services roles in one of the world's most significant financial institutions, but also providing pathways for some less fortunate members of society to reach their full potential. So, Michelle, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Reese, just wanted to perhaps introduce today's conversation with a little bit of what I found in the news today. I was listening to the radio program today, and it may have not escaped our notice that since the onset of COVID-19, the pandemic, this government has conducted no fewer than 10 U-turns. And the radio broadcaster I was listening to this morning, perhaps this can get us going on a good subject of how we look at our politicians today as we did in comparison to where we did yesterday. 10 U-turns since the onset of the pandemic. Something that a previous Prime Minister of this country, Margaret Thatcher, would have never considered doing. In fact, she stated very openly that she was not for turning. So to both of you, I guess, just to get the conversation going this afternoon, U-turns, are they a sign of weakness in political life at the moment? And should we be critical of people who make U-turns, or are they perhaps an evolving decision-making framework for ever-changing complex situations?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, Jerry. I think it's fascinating. You might be able to hear my kids in the background, and I was someone who was listening to the Education Secretary pretty carefully today about this new mask U-turn. I think a really big deal is being made of it. Perhaps unfairly. It does only affect a very small number of schools in areas that are going into lockdown. And is it really that disruptive to suddenly find out 2 weeks from the start of term that people have to wear masks? I don't think it's necessarily that much of a disruption and a big deal for head teachers to try that conundrum of getting their pupils to wear masks. But perhaps that's just me.
So when I think about this, and I can talk about the impact of the U-turn and the A-level policy and our emerging talent programs, but when you think about it strategically, the government are making day-to-day decisions in a dynamic, complex, changing environment. So I would probably say that the government cannot get inside the OODA loop circle of coronavirus. So all they can do is respond to the latest scientific advice and as the situation unfolds. I actually think that a government who's willing to change a policy position in this sort of bipartisan political system that we have actually shows a lot of flexibility, and the fact that they are putting public health as the number one priority. Who knew what the science was and the epidemiology was pointing to in March? So I would be more concerned if they were held an entrenched policy position that wasn't scientifically led. So that's my view on it.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think for the three of us, and perhaps listeners might not appreciate, in military life, you're constantly reassessing the framework, aren't you? And I think you only do get to the right decision if you include lots of different opinions. And the scientific advice is clearly guiding the government at the moment. I'm not going to say whether I'm a fan or whether I'm not, but it's definitely a facet of, I think, modern leadership, that you just need to be adaptive and you need to keep taking as much information as possible. Michelle, what about you throughout your military career? And I know it's been a unique military career prior to coming to JPMorgan. Is that something you always had to show, or what else are the key insights you've learned from that?
I think absolutely. I mean, a function of being a good leader is to have a continuous feedback loop, and not being able to reassess your own estimate halfway through the process is actually, to me, a failure of leadership, because you're always having to adapt your approach according to whatever the parameters are. And I've been in a number of situations where that was the case, and most notably when we ran the training for the military force that supported the Olympics in 2012. We thought it was going to be X, and very quickly it became Z. And you're always having to adapt and change. And I think it shows sort of mental alacrity and a great deal of sort of personal flexibility, and leading towards a more situational approach of leadership.
Do you think there's some level of indoctrination that we have perhaps, and other military veterans perhaps fall under, because we are so used to, and there's this beautiful phrase in the military, isn't there? On the bus, off the bus. Things just change all the time. And growing up in that environment and in the formative years of your professional career must have an impact on you as a leader, just to get on with change and perhaps accept change when other people wouldn't.
No, I agree. And I can see this unfolding quite clearly, within the firm at the moment, where we're grappling with what return to office should look like, what it looks like for different businesses and different locations. And I just take a really kind of, we'll see what the day holds, and we'll go with the current thinking. But for some people, it causes a great deal of emotional stress not to have a very clear understanding of what the next 3 to 4 weeks might be. And I think very much that in our military careers, we are all on the bus, off the bus. You're posted overseas and then you're not, and so that sort of resilience to change and the resilience to the changing information environment, I think, is what gives veterans maybe a USP in the workplace. Not saying that our commercial colleagues don't necessarily have that. I think the differentiator is that that's our norm rather than our exception in the military.
So let me perhaps ask: is that a quality that you're finding you are advertising to your commercial colleagues in JPMorgan about veterans, and conversely, is it something that you're telling them perhaps not to dial up so much when they come in to make themselves out that they're the only people that can do it? I guess what I'm asking is this a quality that people is underrepresented in the commercial space at the moment? And how should we address that?
So my advice to any vets joining on one of our programs or in direct hire is absolutely be aware of the diversity of thought and the cognitive diversity that you contribute to your team, because that's why you've been hired. Is that hiring managers want individual thinkers, but don't sort of put yourself in a situation where you're situating that your thinking is the only way, or in that way. I always say is try and have your skill set be complementary to your team. So look where you can complement the team with your different thinking and your different approach, rather than trying to lead a march as it's the only way. But certainly our hiring managers sort of reflect back to us on a regular basis that they find that the freshness of approach that some of the military thinking brings, like, really very beneficial to the team sort of output and deliverable.
So when you're talking to a hiring manager about bringing someone on from the military or the veteran community, what is any stereotypes they might have about the type of people coming from the military?
Yeah, so we do actually a lot of training around that. So we have veteran resource centres that can be accessible for the hiring manager and the veterans to understand each other's perspective. So, for the uneducated individual, there are stereotypes that veterans can only take direct orders. They'd be very shouty, or quite autocratic in their leadership style. And I spend a long time explaining that leadership in the military actually, for the majority of the time, has to be quite subtle, because you're working with blended teams, with partnerships with commercial enterprises, civil servants, contractors on station. So the autocratic, pointy hand leadership, that has its place in a field environment, but the majority of veterans would not sort of actually contribute that approach. So we deliberately make sure that we have that conversation. And then importantly, that sometimes commercial leadership can be quite subtle. So it's more of an implied task, or more of a, shall we have a conversation about that, which is actually, I need you to do this. Whereas in the military context, sometimes that would be a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more stated. So we do address that in our orientation training to help our vets understand that, they won't get like a list of tasks from their manager, but likewise, we ask the managers to set clear objectives and give goals and have regular check-ins against progress.
I can see that will be a balancing act, actually, and as soon as you bring these two different types of people together, that's a task. So I think I can say with confidence that military people provide. I think what you're saying is that they provide a sense of diversity to your workplace, your current workplace. But we do tend to be quite stereotypical, don't we? Especially sort of seniorish people coming out of officer ranks, and maybe warrant officer ranks. And I know you're doing a lot of work to increase that diversity. Is there any advice that you can give to those veterans who may be considering a career in financial services, into how they would market themselves better through this transition process?
So I would say that this piece of advice would be sector agnostic, and it's the number one thing I lead with whenever I talk to people, excuse me, is to absolutely understand what your personal and professional motivations are. If you haven't done the work on yourself to identify what sorts of roles, actually give you professional contentment, you could have a lot of false starts. So I get a lot of calls of, hi, Michelle, here's my CV. Have you got any roles that would be a fit for me? And my response is always, I have no idea, because I don't know, what drives you, what your motivators are, what inspires you. And so one of the things I ask everybody to do if they're considering JPMorgan is to read the chairman's letter to shareholders. So every year, Jamie Dimon writes out to shareholders, and he gives a great rundown of what the firm's achieved in that year. And I say that to individuals, not so that they should be memorizing numbers and pie charts, but as they're going through the different sectors and the different lines of business, they'll begin to have an emotional reaction about what they're reading. Is it interesting? Do they want to know more? So it's a really good way of finding, what your motivators are. And I think some people are motivated by the kudos of an organization, and, that's fine, but you've got to find where within that organization you feel that you'd be a best fit based on, your skill set and actually what you're interested in.
I think that's great advice, and probably something that everyone should think about annually, whether or not they're looking for a big career move, right? Michelle, I saw that just before the pandemic, you recruited a remarkable number of interns, military interns, onto your program at JPMorgan. How does that feel, and what can we expect going forward now in terms of numbers of people going through these internship programs when the operating environment has changed so much?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Thank you. So in February of this year, we started 50 vets on 2 programs. One, the military transition program, which is a 6-month paid placement across our lines of business in London, Bournemouth, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. And then an inaugural program called Military Pathways, which I believe is a unique offering in the UK market, which is it's a 2-year rotational program that offers an MBA, a fully funded MBA as well. So we had brilliant high hopes at the start of, at the start of February, and then 6 weeks later, these 50 individuals who started with us found themselves on Zoom calls at home. So we had to do a huge amount of work around a wraparound around that, reach outs. We had all different sorts of drop-in centres, meetings. And the first thing I thought about was, how do we ensure that these individuals don't fall off a cliff end in August? Because traditionally August is, for the 6-month programme, August is, quite a slow period in terms of recruiting. So I began early engagement and conversations with our lines of business about sort of underwriting the programme a little bit in terms of extending individuals in position to the end of the year to see, give them the best possible chance of securing a permanent role. What's really great to see is that in 3 of our locations in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Bournemouth, we're already nearly completely converted to full-time roles. And in London, we're seeing that real uptick following the school holiday. So I'm hoping that between September and October, we'll see the traditional level of conversion. In terms of going forward, we obviously gave a lot of thought to that. And we decided that probably now more than ever, there is a need for these sorts of programs, to help people orientate into the commercial setting. So we're all steam ahead, and we're actually expanding. So we're bringing 2 further European locations on board in 2021, providing all the planning goes according to the way I want it to. So we're bringing on board Frankfurt and Dublin. And what's been fantastic is seeing the response of the country heads to doing that. There's a real commitment to providing opportunity. So we're not in any way sort of getting smaller. We ran across the spring and the summer a number of events to actually reach out, as Jerry was talking about, to some of those maybe underrepresented groups from veteran hiring. We know the army is 90% white men, and absolutely that's the way it is. But there are pockets of underrepresentation, whether that's from other ranks and NCOs, female service leavers, or maybe BAME service leavers, to ensure that they felt that JPMorgan as a destination was accessible and achievable for them. So we've been running a whole host of Zoom events. We've been learning tons along the way. We've had some epic failures as well with the technology, but we've got into a really great place. And actually in our attraction pipeline now, we have tripled the number of people in our attraction pipeline since this time last year. So we're certainly not thinking of slowing down.
Those are incredible numbers, and I'm sure even just across the financial sector, but globally, I think there are organisations who are struggling to cope with the same sort of challenge. But to have those kind of results is great. And I know you're benefiting the veterans community, and I think it comes from the fact that you've had to adapt. We were talking about U-turns at the start of this conversation, but you've had to make some really major adaptations and also some great innovations in your role at leading a team in JPMorgan. But I want to track back, Michelle, to what I know to be a stellar military career and some of the challenges that you faced being a woman as an officer in the Royal Air Force and not a pilot. We can go down that rabbit hole if you want to. What are the personal leadership qualities that you've found most impactful in your career, and perhaps how have you used those to generate success in this new role of yours?
Thanks. First of all, there's no chance I'd ever be a pilot. I have zero aptitude, so I definitely wouldn't put myself in that frame. But I think to answer that question, I'll probably go back to one of the first jobs I ever had in the RAF, which was OCP1, so in charge of discipline, court martials, and all the good stuff at RAF Honington, which is pretty much an all-male station in the depths of Suffolk. And there were only 20 women on a station of, I think, about 2,500 men. And I was a 23-year-old flying officer in charge of all the orderly rooms and court martials. And so you can imagine, it was a tall order. But, I wasn't a 6'4" strapping regiment officer with a badge of, a para badge on my arm. So I couldn't sort of meet force with force. So I had to, I think, adapt a situational leadership approach before the word had been invented. So I had to be really tuned in and have really, really sort of live emotional intelligence of what was going on in the room, how the discussions were going. And rather than sort of meet force with force, was really use influence and negotiation skills that I probably didn't even know I was doing. It was just almost like that was the only way I could get my job done. And the other massive early learning I had is that genuinely you're only as good as the parts of your team. And I was so fortunate to have brilliant senior NCOs who supported me, guided me, and in return, I trusted them. And so it was almost like a momentum that built. With the more trust I gave them, the more support they gave to me. So I think that I carried with me all the way through my career. I'm not saying that it was always perfect and I never got anything wrong. I'm sure I got tons of things wrong. But from day one, it was literally, you cannot do this by yourself. Leaders don't have the solutions. Teams do. I heard that was a very famous general who said that once. So
we might know who he is. If I can just ask a quick follow-up on that, because I think what you're displaying there, and I think what you've displayed since you've been at JPMorgan is that the power of influence to get things done, and the power of humility as well. You must come across a lot of very confident service officers leaving the military service. Is there any advice that you give them, given that we're all sort of inculcated with a high level of personal confidence? Is there any advice you would give on humility as you transition to the commercial sector?
Absolutely. What I would say is that a veteran is valued for their skill set, they're valued for their experience, but that doesn't entitle you to anything. So humility for me is one of the most rated qualities that I look for in an applicant. And that's not underselling yourself, and that's not sort of not being willing to, be articulate about your achievements, but it's the manner in which you do that. And being aware that, previous rank or cap badge, it isn't an entitlement to a pathway, and that you have to have the humility to be able to demonstrate that you are willing to learn. One of the big things I say to people when they come into FS is that, I wouldn't take an executive director from the investment bank and ask him to fly an F-35. So similarly, don't expect that you can come from the military and come in at a certain level. So there has to be an acceptance that there is an accommodation whilst you actually generate your sector knowledge. But what we do find is that those vets who come in and they want to go into, say, a banking role, and they accept that entry level position, is that all of those anchor skills that they bring with them, so the great leadership, the great emotional intelligence, the team dynamic, the ability to work with complexity, that advances them, quicker at a later date once their subject matter expertise is at the level required.
Michelle, isn't it so fortunate that you happen to meet the most humble helicopter pilot that the British Army has ever produced?
I started at the very top of the pyramid. So my holding job in the RAF was working for the Red Arrows. Okay, so I was a public affairs officer for the Red Arrows for 9 months. So after that experience.
Let me follow Michelle up on that, because I was walking across. I think I might have told both of you this story before, but humility is really important when you're an Army Air Corps pilot, because the resistance, the temptation to tell everyone you're a pilot is just too much, isn't it? But this pilot here happens to have an accolade that no one else in the Army Air Corps had, and I found that out when I was actually, after I transitioned from military service, and I was walking across Horse Guards Parade one night, and an old friend called me who was head of training and selection in the Army Air Corps. And I hadn't heard from him for years. And I said, what on earth are you phoning me for at this time of night? He said, I've just found out an awesome statistic. He said, do you know you've got the lowest ever aptitude score in history of somebody who made it all the way to get their wings in the Army Air Corps? So humility is really important, Reece, especially if you haven't got the talent to back anything up. Michelle, maybe I could just follow that up. That's great advice for people coming in. I think there is a sense that you are built up by the forces to say you're going to be able to walk into any job. Has that changed? Has that transition journey changed in the last year? Obviously, particularly in the last 6 months, but in the last year or so, or the last 2 years since you've been at JPMorgan, have you seen a change in people's behaviour coming out of the military and looking for worthwhile employment? I
think the education has got better. So, we started our program 10 years ago, and we started with 6 people, and it was literally people recruiting from their own networks, and it's got bigger and bigger over the years. And I've been in 2.5 years, and that focus has been very much on professionalizing the program, ensuring we've got best practice, all the great education and training resources. But one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is looking outwards. So working with veteran organisations such as the Officers Association, Career Transition Partnership, MOD itself, and the resettlement organisations, to ensure that we as a large employer are providing the best information that we can. Because if someone comes to me and they're not well prepared, I don't instantly judge them, because I think back to my resettlement journey and how little I actually knew. And I've been working cross-government with large defence companies. So someone coming from a really regimental system, they might not have even had the exposure. So we do a lot. So this is what all of our financial taster weeks around, our master classes, is really helping people prepare for their exit, and teaching them how to, not just the practical things of write a CV, but their approach and the research that's required, and how to approach conversations and the sorts of language that they should be using. So I actually take that on as a responsibility of our program, is that preparation and that pipeline engagement, because it's really tough. How do you have a conversation about a role that you don't actually really know what it is? So we invest a lot upstream, which is why I say to, on the first day of the orientation week, people who join our program, if we've selected you in, we want you to succeed. This program is about getting you where you need to be, for your first permanent role at JPMorgan. This isn't a program that is looking for some sort of gladiatorial contest or survival of the fittest. We've done all the hard work to get you here. Now let's get you to the platform for your future career. That's how we situate it.
And Michelle, before people have that first conversation with you, first conversation with a prospective employer anywhere, where should they go to find out more information?
So I think before you speak to an employer, just do some due diligence, do some open source intelligence, Google everything, look into the firm, understand who they are, understand what they do, use the resources that the Ministry of Defence provides, use the Career Transition Partnership and the OA and the White Ensign Association. There's a plethora of people out there. And most importantly, tap your network. There will be people in different sectors that you will know. Everybody will pay it back or pay it forward. We've all been there, and we all want to help someone. So the biggest thing I say to people is you've got to own your own transition journey. Sending a recruiter or someone like me a CV and saying, can you tell me if there's any jobs that are suitable, is not a great entry point. You've got to have demonstrated that you've done the work and that you're driving your own resettlement. I think that's super important.
Michelle, those are really great points, and I'm sure we could talk for longer, but then it takes for a cup of tea to get cold. I think if I can sum up what I think you're saying about the journey, and thanks so much for giving us your perspective on that, and for your perspectives on leadership as a whole. I think you're making 3 really, really important points. And the first one is understand your own personal motivation for what you want to do as you leave military service, because it is such a different world out there, and it's such a wide world that people have to be really sure about what they do. Approach the situation with humility, and I think that's a lesson that many people can take, not just probably leaving the service, but I think humility is a really valuable concept in the current environment in particular. And I think what you were talking about at the end there is you start this new journey of learning, so have a commitment to that. Do you have any sort of, I think that's what the 3 points you've given us today, and they're super valuable. Do you have any sort of final comments on that before I hand over to Reese to wrap up?
No, what I would say about the learning is that it's very much, when you're in a new sector, it's a commitment every day, to learning, to not let things wash over you, and to have that inquisitive mind, and if you really want to make a success of a second career, in the same way as you went to Sandhurst or Cranwell for a year and you committed yourself wholeheartedly to that training, do the same. be relevant, ask good questions, take the online training courses, upskill in what you need to. For us, it's usually Excel, or something like that, or whether it's agile methodology, and be prepared for that learning journey. And, all your anchor skills that you've accumulated in the forces will support you.
Michelle, that's great advice. Thank you. And I heard the other day that you're actually getting rid of Jerry for a week next week as he goes on some kind of midlife crisis, spiritual journey across the country.
He's well past midlife crisis, Reese. This is yeah. Jerry's of a second passion in life after me, although actually I think I come a second to it, is motorbiking. He's an avid motorbiker, and he's always wanted, for as long as I've known him, to do a motorbike adventure of some sort. And prior to COVID, he'd actually signed up to this, what I think is slightly crazy, sort of off-road biking across the Moroccan desert, which was cancelled. So he then set his sights on riding his beloved Triumph 900 Scrambler. Impressed that I know that from Land's End to John O'Groats. So I wave him off with a fond tear of farewell, hoping that he's safe on his journey.
I think that's probably a good way to sum up, is to say the key to good sort of home working at the moment is getting rid of your husband for a week. Be nice and peaceful in the house. Michelle, thanks so much for joining us today. Reese, any final comments?
That's it from me. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Tea and Medals podcast. If you like what you've heard, please give us a 5-star rating on iTunes and share us on social media. You can find us both on LinkedIn and on the Tea and Medals YouTube channel. Thank you again. See you next time.